The Prime Minister issues an apology in the House of Commons on behalf of everyone in it, a day after the Speaker of the House of Commons announced his resignation. Anthony Rota stepped down for honouring a war veteran after Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky's address to Parliament, who it turns out was a Nazi. As you saw there, the Prime Minister's statement in the House today didn't go far enough for opposition leaders. With us now to respond to that criticism, Government House Leader Karina Gould. Hi, Minister Gould. Good to have you back on the program. Thank you for making the time.
Thanks for having me, Vassy.
You said, Minister, yesterday the Speaker should have resigned as soon as he found out the man he recognized was a Nazi. Why did the Prime Minister wait 3 days to apologize?
Well, look, I think the Speaker needed to take responsibility for his actions. I think, he apologized and he said he took responsibility, but until he resigned, I don't think the space was there for the Prime Minister to make the remarks, which he did today, which I think was the right thing to do. And he did so on behalf of parliamentarians, but also on behalf of all Canadians, because what happened last Friday was an embarrassment to us in Parliament, it was an embarrassment to us in Canada, and it is something that is deeply shameful for us all.
The Speaker resigned exactly 24 hours before the Prime Minister made the statement that he did, going into the House and then in the House as well. He was in Toronto yesterday for another event. The opposition accused him of avoiding being in the House of Commons for this very reason. Do you understand the genesis of that critique, and would it have been maybe helpful in mitigating the impact of what did unfold in the House of Commons on Friday if that apology had come much sooner after the Speaker's resignation?
Well, look, we didn't know when the Speaker was going to resign. We didn't know that he was going to do that yesterday. Of course, the Prime Minister called on him to do that yesterday morning, as did I, as did many other members of Parliament and parties, in fact. So we had no prior knowledge that that was what he was going to do and when he was going to do it. But what I would say is that the opposition is really misleading Canadians here, because they have tried to put the blame on the Prime Minister when indeed this was something that was solely the initiative of the Speaker of the House of Commons. No one in the chamber that Friday had any prior knowledge that he had either invited this individual or that he was going to ask us to recognize him and pay tribute to him. And I have to say that he deeply broke the trust of parliamentarians and indeed all Canadians by doing that.
Yeah, let me separate for a second the opposition's criticism in that vein from just the fact that I'm thinking of people sitting outside watching, Canadians who watched that unfold and then saw the ensuing reaction. And I understand what you're saying, what the Speaker did, which is that was his decision solely. He invited the person, he recognized them. But to an outsider, it looked like something very impactful happened. It looked like everyone stood up. Do you understand how they would think, well, look, even if it wasn't a vetted person or the Prime Minister didn't have a role in this, it makes sense for the government to acknowledge, perhaps going forward you should, or that there was a failure in the system that led to something like this happening. And your government has refused to do that so far.
Well, Vassy, I think what's really important is, first of all, you're right in that every single person that was in the chamber that day, doesn't matter if they were on the government side or the opposition, the leader of the opposition stood as well, but we were all misled. Nobody knew the background of this individual, and I can guarantee you that I don't think a single person in that chamber would have stood had they known who this individual was, and had the Speaker shared his actual background, that he fought with the Waffen-SS and was fighting alongside the Nazis. I don't think a single person would have stood. We were all misled, and it was a huge, terrible moment for all of us. But where I have to make a distinction, and something that is really important here, is that there is a separation between Parliament and the government. Parliament is an independent institution. The Speaker is independent of government. And so while the Parliamentary Protective Service absolutely vets every single individual who comes in for security reasons, they would do criminal background checks, make sure there's no security threat, the Speaker has the Speaker's gallery, and he has the authority and the prerogative and the privilege to invite individuals into that gallery. And it would be a complete departure from the separation of government and Parliament for the government to vet those individuals, because parliamentarians have that prerogative and that privilege. And what I find very concerning about what Mr. Poilievre is saying is that he would actually dictate, should he become prime minister, what Parliament does. And that is a big departure from the separation of these institutions, which I think is fundamental to our democracy.
But Minister, like I said, I'm separating this line of questioning from the opposition's critique. And I'm thinking, for example, as just a regular Canadian watching the president of a country with which Russia has declared war on, using the justification of denazification of Ukraine. Like in that instance, not just a regular day in Parliament, a regular question period, do you not see how Canadians would be thinking, hey, why isn't there a better process in place? And might there be a need to examine that going forward more formally? I'm not saying that the government should dictate what Parliament does, but when the president of a country at war with Russia is visiting, is there not the impetus for the government to be more discerning about who is in the room?
Look, Vassy, that's a debate that we would have to have in terms of parliamentary independence and privilege. And I understand where Canadians would be coming from, but that's why I actually think it's really important to explain and have clear what the roles of these different institutions are. And even if you're saying you're separating this critique from what the Conservatives are saying, it can't be separated, because it would have a significant impact on the role of these two institutions. What I do hope is that every single member of Parliament, both current and future, will learn from this instance and actually do their due diligence, because what's most upsetting here is that the Speaker invited this individual and decided to recognize him in front of everyone. I would say that what the Speaker should have done, even though he has the independence to do that, and he runs the House of Commons, not the government. And remember, the President of Ukraine came and addressed the Houses of Parliament, and that is ultimately the purview of the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Speaker of the Senate. Is he should have told someone he was going to do this. And then if he had done that and shared that ahead of time, then absolutely government protocol, the apparatus behind it would have done that background check and said, you know, maybe this is not a good idea, because do you know who this individual is? And we absolutely cannot have this happen while the president of Ukraine, as you mentioned, is a wartime president and visiting us. So this is a very, very serious instance. And I think on behalf of Parliament, there absolutely needs to be a better process in place.
And will you pursue that as government House Leader? I mean, you have the power to start a process that would see that change going forward. Is that something you'd commit to doing this evening?
Well, Vassy, as I said, that's actually the purview of the Speaker. We are going to be having an election on Tuesday for the new Speaker. You know, as the Prime Minister said, if the Speaker, who's independent from government, right, wishes to have guests vetted by the government, we will certainly work with all opposition parties to do that. But again, this is a big departure from how our Parliament, our democracy has worked for over 150 years in this country, and frankly, hundreds of years in other Westminster systems around the world.
I understand that, but this wasn't just any sitting of Parliament. This wasn't, like I said, just any question period. This was a visit from a wartime president in which denazification is used as a justification from Russia, and there was a Nazi in the gallery. Just really quickly, has there been...
so unbelievably horrific.
I listened to the Prime Minister get a question from the Bloc Québécois, I believe today, the leader, asking if he had personally apologized or reached out to President Zelensky, and he did not provide a specific answer. Has that happened?
So my understanding is there have been many communications between Canada and Ukraine on this, to the President as well, and that those apologies and, you know, absolute regret for this having happened has happened.
Can you specify what you mean by many communications? Does that, am I to interpret from that that the Prime Minister has not spoken directly with President Zelensky on the issue?
So I understand that this has been communicated through diplomatic channels at many different levels.
So the Prime Minister has not personally reached out to President Zelensky?
So I know that the Prime Minister and the President speak often, but I understand that this has been communicated through diplomatic channels.
And just really quickly before I let you go, Minister, I know that there have been a
Sure.
lot of calls as well, particularly from Jewish advocacy groups, whom I've interviewed on the program over the past few evenings, for the Duchesne Commission, the portion of that commission from the 80s that was not unsealed, that essentially named the Nazis who had immigrated to Canada to be unsealed. Is that an endeavor your government supports?
Well, I think that it merits a much broader conversation. I think given what happened on Friday, there's a very difficult history and a shameful one, really, of allowing Nazi collaborators into Canada. And we need to get to the bottom of this. This is something that I think we need to continue to engage with Jewish groups on. And, you know, I can tell you as someone who's the descendant of a Holocaust survivor, I think we need to get to the bottom of this.
Do you think personally, as the descendant of Holocaust survivors, that unsealing those records would help in addressing the gaps that what's happened over the past few days make evident?
I mean, it's a good question. I don't know how many of those people are still alive. But I think it would bring closure for those of us in Canada and around the world who've been affected by the Holocaust. And I think it's something that is important to continue to pursue and engage in.
Okay, Minister Gould, I'll leave it there. I really do appreciate your time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.